Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota. He is also in this larger bipartisan group. They're trying some things, but I want to start first with Ukraine and this aid. Let me ask you this, Senator, between COVID relief and the Ukrainian aid, if Title 42 is not inside this conversation, do you suspect Ukrainian aid and COVID relief come through fairly quickly?
Well, I think if we could bifurcate all of them, we could have straight up or down votes, and we'd certainly pass Ukrainian aid, and we'd probably struggle with COVID aid, again, apart from Title 42, to your point. But Ukrainian aid and the crisis in Ukraine is, obviously universal in terms of the politics, and who knows, when you need something really bad, when there's low-hanging fruit, sometimes you can get other things done if it's attached to the low-hanging fruit. However, COVID aid is not as low-hanging fruit as Ukraine is.
So just to clarify, this becomes a bit harder on Ukrainian aid if it is linked with COVID?
I think it becomes more difficult. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it becomes more difficult, and I think it becomes more political. And Ukrainian aid so far has been bipartisan, and I'd prefer it remain that.
Let me move to why we wanted both you and Senator Hickenlooper on. You're part of a conversation, a larger conversation about a climate and energy package. Obviously, we have some national security issues and some obligations we have to fulfill with our own energy, with natural gas. We've got the issue currently with high gas prices. So what's realistic? What would a bipartisan climate and energy deal look like to you?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because as I listen to John Hickenlooper, I'm reminded why I like him so much. I'm sitting there thinking, well, I could have answered all those questions exactly like that, and it's no wonder we're in the same room. That said, it does get, you do have to start thinking about the negotiation. What price is one side willing to pay to the other price to get, what they need and what they want? What I think is realistic is if we would have some fuel neutral things, for example. By that I mean if we're going to go into the tax code and start talking about credits, let's focus on emissions, not on the fuel choice, because the fuel choice becomes part of the politics. The other thing I think that's really important, Chuck, that we don't acknowledge often enough, and that is if all we did, and I'm not suggesting this be the package, but if all we did is replaced Venezuelan oil with American oil, or Vladimir Putin's natural gas with LNG from the United States, we'd already be bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, and it could be considered climate. That said, I know that's not good enough for Democrats. So I think he put everything on the table. I think you and I have talked about this enough. You can't have a discussion with non-starters. So let's put everything on the table and work through it. So for me, I think we have to get into the tax code a little bit. We have to start helping investment in things like carbon capture, and but the LNG piece, I think, is the really big piece. It's the urgent piece. It's the piece where there are a number of projects that are just waiting to be approved. I think opening up more production. You asked an important question about long-term, and the problem with a lot of this is it's capital intensive, and you can't deal with a crisis at the moment and not give the investor some long-term certainty. So I think I agree with John. We need to have longer-term plans that coincide with these longer-term investments.
I know you're trying to figure out if there's a bipartisan answer on immigration. I'm not going to pretend that the comprehensive immigration reform can come together. But can you have an asylum reform conversation with this group that you guys are working together with?
Yeah, I mean, it would obviously have to involve some other members that are on the relevant committees, but actually it was interesting listening to you guys talk, because asylum, we have a pretty decent asylum policy if we actually enact it. But we also, to John's point, have a really big short-term and I think long-term workforce shortage, and that ranges from part-time, low-skilled, to the very high-skilled. We need a skills-based immigration policy, and asylum can fit right into that. Right now, if you're an asylum seeker and you get into the United States and you wait for the processing, you don't get to work. We have people who need workers, and we have asylum seekers who need income. I think that's a reasonable discussion that reasonable people on both sides could have.
Senator, the politics of this on your side of the aisle, sometimes just being for these visas, what you just described, you get hit from the far right as saying, there's almost a zero tolerance policy on any immigration. How do you sell it at home?
Well, it's a really important point, but I think we're in a window, just like we have this window opening in Europe that that presents this grand opportunity for a significant climate and energy policy, we have a workforce crisis that opens up the door for a more significant immigration policy discussion, particularly around skills-based. You're right. I mean, I've introduced H-1B reforms and have taken it blows to the head from the right. People who would otherwise, I think, understand don't, because it's got the word immigration attached to it. That's why big people, adult people, need to step up and then explain ourselves. You got to be willing to go out and sell it. I can sell it in North Dakota, but everybody needs to sell it where they live. And I do think there are enough specific examples, whether it's physicians or specialists in medicine or engineers or laborers in factories or fields. There's a growing demand. It's a growing understanding of that demand. I mean, by the way, inflation itself is driven largely because of supply chains that are broken, and the supply chains are largely broken for lack of people to do the work to get products to where they need to get. So I think we're at a moment where the crisis demands the discussion. Part of the problem, though, Chuck, politically, is the Biden administration is making it so easy to be a Republican to do nothing that some Republicans are motivated to do nothing. I like to run through the tape, if you know what I mean.
Well, I'll say this, and it's in isolation, but we heard from you and Senator Hickenlooper, and you're right. Your answers were more similar than different, which is a reminder that when it comes to a lot of issues, the disagreements are a lot smaller than we give them credit for. Senator Kevin Cramer.
It's just nice to talk about it on your show, Chuck. It really is. I think that's part of the important thing that needs to happen.
Well, more dialogue and more public dialogue always helps. Kevin Cramer, Republican senator from North Dakota.